The flash drive burns in my palm, encrypted proof of everything. My brother's security team moves in, hands on their holsters, calling me a trespasser at Dad's funeral. I shove a guard into the flowers and run, but the lawyer's face goes white when he sees the black sedan idling by the gates. The will I came to enforce? Replaced 48 hours ago. And now we're both staring at the car, knowing what comes next. The estate freezes, the money's gone, and that sedan isn't leaving empty-handed. Moist heat pressed against Claire Sterling's neck like a damp wool blanket. The scent of gardenias and freshly turned earth hung heavy in the Savannah air, thick enough to taste. Around her, the Sterling clan stood in a crescent of black silk and polished granite, their faces frozen in masks of practiced grief. Claire's thumb traced the jagged edge of the flash drive hidden deep in her blazer pocket. The plastic felt cold, a sharp contrast to the humid afternoon. Her father, Arthur Sterling, was in the box, or so the world believed. To the public, it was the end of an era. To Claire, it was the opening bell of a cage match. She didn't look at the casket. Instead, her eyes scanned the perimeter of the Bonaventure Cemetery. The Spanish moss hung from the ancient oaks like gray, strangled hair, unmoving in the stagnant air. She felt the weight of her leather accordion folder tucked under her arm, the crinkle of paper receipts providing a rhythmic comfort against her ribs. Every financial record, every dinner expense, every mile driven was documented within. She knew that in this family, if you couldn't prove where you were with a piece of ink-stained paper, you simply didn't exist. Her brother, Michael, stood 3 feet away. He was cracking his knuckles in that rhythmic, predatory sequence. Thumb, index, middle, ring, pinky. Pop, pop, pop. The sound was a starting gun for a lie. He leaned closer, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and peppermint. "Nice touch with the pearls, Claire," Michael whispered, his voice a low rasp through the priest's drone. "Father always loved your sense of theater." Claire tightened her grip on the drive, the metal casing digging into her palm. She focused on the rhythmic thud of the gravedigger's shovels hitting the soft Georgia clay. A bead of sweat trickled down her spine, stinging a patch of sunburnt skin. He didn't love anything he couldn't buy, Michael. Her brother's lips curled into a thin, bloodless smile. He adjusted his silk tie, his movements fluid. "You think you're holding a winning hand, don't you? The little silver secret in your pocket? We know about the offshore diversions, Claire. We know you've been playing accountant in the dark." The air suddenly felt thinner. Claire realized Michael wasn't just mourning. He was hunting. He signaled with a slight nod of his head toward the edge of the oak trees. 3 men in identical charcoal suits, Michael's private security, detached themselves from the shadows. They moved with a mechanical, heavy-footed grace, their eyes locked on Claire. The funeral had been a lure, and she had walked straight into the mouth of the trap. The lead guard, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, stepped onto the manicured grass of the Sterling plot. He didn't offer condolences. He reached for Claire's arm, his fingers like iron clamps. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," the guard muttered, his voice a low vibration that Claire felt in her teeth. "Family matter." Claire didn't scream. Screaming was for people who didn't have a plan. She felt the rough fabric of his suit against her skin and the smell of stale coffee on his breath. As his hand closed around her bicep, she shifted her weight, recalling the hours of self-defense training she'd taken in a strip mall gym in Atlanta. She drove her elbow back into the soft tissue of his ribs. A grunt of air escaped him. Using the momentum, she shoved him with both hands. He stumbled back, his boots catching on the edge of a massive floral arrangement of white lilies. He went down in a tangle of wire and crushed petals, the cloying scent of bruised flowers exploding into the air. Claire didn't wait for him to find his footing. She bolted. She ran past the weeping stone angels and the crumbling Victorian monuments. Her heels sank into the soft sand, but she didn't slow down. Behind her, she heard the frantic shouting of the guards and the rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of heavy shoes hitting the earth. She ducked behind a mausoleum, the cold marble biting into her shoulder as she pressed against it. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed to reach the gate. She needed to reach Robert Henderson. The cemetery exit was a blur of wrought iron and gravel. Claire's car, a modest sedan that looked like a toy compared to the black SUVs idling nearby, was parked just outside the perimeter. She saw Robert Henderson, the family's longtime attorney, standing near the gate. He looked like a man made of crumpled paper, his suit hanging off his thin frame, his eyes frantically tracking the ceiling of the sky as if counting invisible tiles. "Robert!" Claire gasped, skidding to a halt in front of him. Her lungs burned with the humid air. The lawyer flinched, his eyes darting upward in a frantic grid pattern. 42, he muttered under his breath. A nervous tick Claire knew meant he was about to deliver a blow. "I have the injunction," Claire said, her voice shaking but firm. She reached into her accordion folder and pulled out a crisp, white document. "This freezes everything. The estate, the diversions, the liquidation. Michael can't touch a cent until the probate court reviews the offshore records. You have to file this now." Robert took the paper with trembling fingers. He looked at the seal of the court, then back at Claire. For a moment, she saw a flicker of the man who had taught her how to ride a bike, the man who had once promised to protect her from her father's whims. He tucked the injunction into his leather briefcase, the latch clicking with a finality that made Claire's shoulders drop an inch. The asset freeze was in place. She had won a reprieve, but the relief was a fleeting ghost. Robert didn't move toward his car. He stood frozen, staring past Claire at a dark sedan idling by the cemetery gates. The windows were tinted a deep, impenetrable black. The engine hummed with a low, predatory vibration that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Claire's feet. "Claire," Robert whispered, his voice barely audible over the cicadas. "There's something you don't understand. Something that happened while you were digging through those old ledgers." "What are you talking about, Robert?" "The injunction holds. I checked the statutes. The statutes don't matter when the foundation has shifted," Robert said, his eyes still fixed on the black car. He leaned in, the scent of old tobacco and expensive scotch wafting from his clothes. 48 hours ago, while your father was... while he was still with us, a new codicil was signed. A private amendment to the will. Claire felt a cold prickle dance across her skin. "That's impossible. I've been monitoring his legal filings for months. He didn't have the capacity to sign anything." "He had help," Robert murmured. He looked at her then, and for the first time, his eyes weren't on the ceiling. They were filled with a terrifying, hollow pity. "Michael didn't just find a loophole, Claire. He found a new door, and he's already locked it behind you." The dark sedan's door opened. Michael stepped out, his silk tie perfectly straight, his face a mask of cold triumph. He didn't look like a man who had just buried his father. He looked like a man who had just inherited the world. He walked toward them, the gravel crunching under his polished shoes in a rhythmic, mocking beat. "Thank you, Robert." Michael said, placing a hand on the lawyer's shoulder. The gesture was meant to look affectionate, but Robert withered under the touch. "I'll take it from here." Michael turned to Claire, his eyes unblinking. "The injunction was a smart move, sister. Truly, it showed initiative. But as of 2 days ago, I am the sole executor of the Sterling estate. Every asset, every account, and every piece of paper in that folder of yours. It all belongs to the chair. And I am the chair." The world seemed to tilt. Claire looked at the flash drive still clutched in her hand. It felt like a useless piece of scrap metal. She had the data, she had the proof. But Michael had the law. Or rather, he had bought a version of the law that she couldn't outrun. "We're going back to the house, Claire," Michael said, his voice oily and slow. "We have a lot to discuss. About the family legacy, about your future, and about how we're going to smooth over these misunderstandings." He didn't wait for her to agree. The guards moved in again, circling her like wolves. Claire looked at Robert, but the lawyer had already turned away, his eyes back on the sky, his lips moving in a silent, desperate count. She was alone in the sun, surrounded by the ghosts of her ancestors and the very real monsters of her present. The drive back to the Sterling mansion was a silent, suffocating affair. Claire sat in the back of the black SUV, flanked by guards whose presence felt like a physical weight. Outside, Savannah's lush greenery blurred into a smear of oppressive emerald. When they reached the estate, the towering windows of the mansion looked like rows of glassy eyes, watching her approach. The air inside the foyer was a biting 60 degrees, a shock to her system that made her breath visible. Michael didn't waste time. Within an hour, he had convened a televised press conference in the grand ballroom. Claire stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching through the cracked door as her brother stood before a forest of microphones. The cameras flashed, their artificial light reflecting off the family portraits on the walls. Generations of Sterling men with their hands painted behind their backs, hiding their secrets. "It is a time of great sorrow for our family," Michael told the reporters, his voice projecting a perfect blend of grief and strength. "But my father's vision for Sterling Global must endure. To that end, a final codicil to his will was discovered, naming me the sole executor and successor. We will move forward with unity. Any rumors of internal strife or financial instability are simply uncurated fictions." Claire felt a surge of nausea. He was erasing her in real time, stripping her of her standing before the entire world. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't fight him in the press, and she couldn't fight him in the courts. Not yet. She needed the source code. She needed the metadata from the original server in the mansion's basement. If she could prove the codicil was a digital forgery, she could blow his narrative apart. She waited until the house settled, until the reporters had cleared out and Michael was sequestered in the study with his advisors. She slipped through the darkened hallways, her feet silent on the thick Persian rugs. She reached the heavy oak door that led to the server room. Her heart hammered as she pressed her thumb against the biometric scanner. The red light didn't turn green. Instead, a sharp, electronic chirp echoed through the hallway. "Access denied." She tried again, her thumb trembling. "Access denied." Michael had wiped her. Every credential, every digital footprint she had within the house was gone. She was a ghost in her own home. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. She wasn't just locked out of the company, she was being purged from the family record. Panic began to rise, a cold tide in her chest. She turned to leave, to find another way out of the house. But as she reached the grand foyer, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. The heavy oak front doors, reinforced with steel, were being bolted from the outside. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the deadbolts echoed through the cavernous room. She ran to the window, pulling back the heavy velvet drapes. Outside, the estate was crawling with men she didn't recognize. They weren't the usual Sterling staff. They were professionals, moving with a grim, tactical efficiency. And then she noticed the silence. The family's two Dobermans, usually barking at every shadow, were nowhere to be seen. The kennels were empty, the yard eerily still. She was trapped. Claire retreated into the mahogany library, the smell of decaying leather and old dust stinging her nose. She needed to think. She needed a weapon. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on a heavy crystal decanter filled with amber scotch sitting on a side table. It was solid, weighted, and dangerous. Looking for a drink, Claire? Or just a way out? The voice came from the shadows near the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Miller, Michael's fixer, stepped into the light. He was a massive man, his chest like a slab of granite, a jagged scar running across his knuckles. He was humming a low, gravelly funeral dirge, a sound that made the air in the room seem to vibrate with a terrifying frequency. "Michael wants the drive," Miller said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't move toward her yet. He stood with his back against the wall, maintaining a distance of exactly 6 feet. "He says you've had your fun. Now it's time to be a good sister and hand over the toys." "I don't have it," Claire lied, her hand inching toward the decanter. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Miller's eyes narrowed, his posture shifting from relaxed to predatory. "Don't make this a chore, Claire. I've had a long day, and I'd really like to go home." He lunged. Claire grabbed the decanter and swung with everything she had. The crystal shattered against Miller's forearm as he blocked the blow, the scotch spraying across his face and the expensive rug. He didn't even flinch. He grabbed her wrist, his grip so tight she heard the joints pop. "My turn," he grunted. He threw her against the bookshelves. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and for a second, the world went gray. She felt the rough leather of the books against her face, the smell of old paper filling her lungs. Miller was on her in a second, his massive hand pinning her throat against the shelf. "The drive," he hissed. Claire's fingers fumbled along the shelf behind her. Her hand closed around a small, cold metal lever, a hidden latch she hadn't used since she was a child playing hide-and-seek. She pulled it. The section of the bookshelf swung inward with a groan of rusted hinges. Miller, caught off balance, stumbled forward into the dark opening. Claire didn't hesitate. She shoved him with her legs, sending him sprawling into the narrow, lightless passage. She scrambled inside after him, but instead of engaging, she turned and sprinted down the cramped, dusty tunnel. It was a servant's passage, a relic of the house's original construction, leading toward the back of the estate. She could hear Miller roaring behind her, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floorboards of the tunnel. She ran blindly, her hands scraping against the rough brick walls, until she saw a sliver of light ahead. She burst through a small door and found herself in the study. The room was a mess. Papers were scattered everywhere, and the air smelled of ozone and scorched dust. At the far end of the room, near a massive industrial shredder, stood her mother, Eleanor. Eleanor was wearing a pale silk scarf, her hands trembling as she fed handfuls of documents into the machine. The high-pitched whine of the blades filled the room, a mechanical scream that seemed to mirror Claire's internal state. "Mother?" Claire gasped, leaning against the desk for support. "What are you doing?" "Michael is trying to kill me. We have to call the police." Eleanor didn't look up. She continued to feed the paper into the shredder, her eyes fixed on the spinning blades. "I'm so sorry, Claire," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the machine. "I'm so sorry. Mother, look at me. I have the proof. I can stop Michael. I can save the Foundation." Subverted. Claire stepped closer, her heart breaking at the sight of her mother's fragile state. Eleanor had always been the victim in this house, the one who stayed silent while Arthur and Michael tore the world apart. Claire felt a sudden, fierce wave of protection. She reached out and took her mother's hands, stopping the flow of paper. "It's okay," Claire said, her voice softening. "I know Michael forced you into this. I know he's using the codicil to scare you. If you tell me the truth, if you help me prove he forged it, I can protect you. We can leave. We can go to that villa in Italy you always talked about." Eleanor finally looked at her. Her eyes were red-rimmed, filled with tears that seemed genuine. She gripped Claire's hands with surprising strength. "You really have it? The evidence of the offshore accounts?" "Everything," Claire promised. "Every penny Michael moved. I can prove he's been draining the charity for years." Eleanor let out a long, shuddering breath. Her shoulders dropped, and she seemed to deflate. "He told me you'd never find it. He said you were too focused on the past to see what was happening right in front of you." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and leaned in close. "The codicil. Michael didn't act alone, Claire. He couldn't have. He didn't have the access codes for the secondary vault. Then who did?" "I did," Eleanor whispered. "I helped him forge the signature. I helped him upload the file to the server." Claire felt a surge of triumph. "That's it. That's the confession I need. If you testify to that, Michael is finished. We can go to the police right now." Eleanor nodded, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "You're right. The truth should be out there. All of it." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, sleek digital recorder. She pressed a button, and the room was suddenly filled with the sound of Claire's own voice. "I can prove he's been draining the charity for years." Claire froze. The warmth in the room seemed to vanish, replaced by a biting, predatory cold. "What are you doing?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Eleanor's face shifted. The fragility was gone, replaced by a cold, surgical hardness that Claire had only ever seen in her father. She stood up straight, her hands no longer shaking. She reached for her silver flask, unscrewed the cap, and took a slow, deliberate sip. "You're so like your father, Claire," Eleanor said, her voice steady and devoid of apology. "Always looking for the glitch. Always assuming the numbers are the only thing that matters. You never stopped to ask why Michael was draining the charity." "He was stealing," Claire said, her mind racing. "No, darling, I was stealing. I've been moving funds from that charity for 20 years. Long before Michael even knew how to balance a checkbook. It was my freedom fund. My way out of this tomb." Eleanor stepped around the desk, the silk of her scarf hissing against her dress. "But when your father died, the audits were going to start, Michael found out. He offered me a deal. I help him secure the estate, and he buries my discrepancies under a mountain of new corporate debt." The realization hit Claire like a physical blow. Her mother wasn't a victim. She was the architect. "And now," Eleanor continued, holding up the recorder, "I have you on tape admitting that you have everything. The evidence of the very crimes I committed. Only I've already altered the digital trail. Those offshore accounts, they aren't in Michael's name, and they aren't in mine." Eleanor leaned in, her breath smelling of artificial sweetener and cold tea. They're in yours, Claire. I've spent the last 48 hours routing the final transfers through your private venture capital firm. To the world, this looks like you've been embezzling from your own family for years. And this recording? It's the sound of you admitting you have the data to prove it. Claire lunged for the recorder, but Eleanor was faster. She stepped back, and the door to the study burst open. Miller was there, his face bruised, but his eyes burning with a dark, satisfied light. "Take her to the cellar," Eleanor said, her voice as sharp as a meat cleaver. "And make sure she stays there until the storm passes. We have a lot of restructuring to do." Claire struggled as Miller's massive arms wrapped around her, but it was useless. As she was dragged from the room, she looked back at her mother. Eleanor was already back at the shredder, calmly feeding the last of the evidence into the blades. The rhythmic tinkle of her silver spoon against the flask, the only sound in the room. The basement wine cellar was a tomb of brick and shadow. The ceiling was so low that Claire felt the arched masonry pressing down on her head, a physical weight that amplified the claustrophobia of the dark. The air was damp, smelling of mold and the sour tang of fermented grapes. Somewhere in the distance, a pipe dripped. Plink, plink, plink. A rhythmic hammer strike against the silence. Miller shoved her into the room and slammed the reinforced steel door. The sound of the bolts sliding home felt like a final judgment. Claire collapsed against a rack of wine bottles, the cold glass biting into her back. She was alone, framed for her mother's crimes and locked in the bowels of the estate while a tropical storm began to howl outside. The wind battered the mansion, a low, mournful flute sound that vibrated through the stone walls. Claire scrambled to her feet, her hands searching the dark. She needed a way out. She began to feel along the walls, her fingers tracing the rough mortar. She moved past thousands of bottles, their labels meticulously peeled off, leaving them as anonymous as she felt. And then her hand hit something hard and metallic behind a crate of vintage Bordeaux. It was an old, hardwired service phone, a relic from a time when the house required a literal army of staff to maintain. She lifted the receiver. To her shock, there was a dial tone, a thin, buzzing thread of hope. She dialed a number she knew by heart. "Sarah, it's Claire. I don't have much time." In San Francisco, 3,000 miles away, Sarah Jenkins sat in her fog-slicked apartment, the crunch of a celery stick audible over the line. "Claire, your signal is bouncing all over the place. What's going on? I'm seeing massive movement in the sterling offshore accounts. Someone is draining the secondary reserves." "It's not Michael, Sarah. It's my mother. She's framing me. She's routing the funds through my VC firm. You have to stop the transfers. Trace the origin point. I need the digital signature of the person actually hitting the send button." "I'm on it," Sarah said, her voice shifting into a professional, rapid-fire cadence. "But Claire, the encryption is shifting. It's like 1,000 fists pounding on a door at once. They're trying to drown out the trail. I need the final decryption key from the drive, the one we labeled the librarian's key." Claire reached into her pocket. The drive was still there. She read the string of characters over the phone, her voice a desperate whisper against the sound of the storm. "Got it," Sarah said. "I'm in. I'm tracking the flow in real time. It's..." "Oh God, Claire. Michael is actively draining the company's remaining reserves right now. He's not just hiding the embezzlement, he's burning the whole house down for the insurance payout." "Document everything, Sarah. Every bite. I need a trail that even Michael can't forge." Suddenly the cellar door groaned. The heavy bolts shrieked as they were forced back. Claire dropped the phone, the receiver dangling and swinging against the brick wall. Michael stepped into the cellar. He looked disheveled, his silk tie loosened, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He was brandishing a handgun, the metal gleaming in the dim light of the hallway. He looked erratic, a man who had realized the walls were closing in and had decided to take everyone down with him. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Michael hissed, waving the gun at her. "Always the favorite, always the one with the pure heart. While I was upstairs doing the dirty work, you were playing at being a hero." "Michael, put the gun down," Claire said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Sarah is tracking the transfers. It's over. The police are already on their way." Michael laughed, a jagged, broken sound. "The police? Oh, they're coming, Claire. But they're not coming for me. Subverted." Michael stepped closer, the scent of bourbon and sweat rolling off him. He didn't look like he was losing. He looked like he was about to deliver a punchline. "You really thought the offshore accounts were the only thing I was working on?" Michael asked, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "You spent so much time looking at the money, you forgot to look at the man. You forgot to look at Father. I know you forged the codicil, Michael." "The codicil was theater, Claire. A distraction to keep you busy while I handled the real problem." Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, amber pill bottle. It was empty. He tossed it onto the stone floor, where it skittered and stopped near Claire's feet. "Recognize that? It's Father's heart medication. Or rather, it's the bottle of medication that accidentally killed him." Claire felt a cold pit open in her stomach. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't just kill him, Claire. I made sure he left a trail." Michael stepped into her personal space, the barrel of the gun cold against her forehead. "I've been wearing your gardening gloves for a week. I used your private stationery to write the suicide note he left behind. And that bottle? The one you just touched? It's covered in your fingerprints. I planted them there while you were asleep in the guest wing last night." Claire's breath hitched. No, that's not possible." "Oh, it's very possible. And the best part? I've already called Detective Wilson. I told him I found you in the study, trying to shred the evidence of your mercy killing. I told him you were distraught, that you were talking about ending it all in the cellar." Michael's eyes burned with a dark, triumphant light. "The police aren't coming to arrest a corporate thief, Claire. They're coming to arrest a murderer. And when they find you down here with a murder weapon and a confession already written in your own hand, well, the Sterling legacy will be safe, and I will be the grieving son who had to do the right thing." The truth hit Claire like a physical blow. She hadn't just lost the company. She had been framed for the one thing she could never undo. Her attempt to find the truth had provided Michael with a perfect cover for his own violence. She was trapped in a locked room with the man who had killed her father, and the law was already on its way to put the handcuffs on her. "Goodbye, Claire," Michael said, his voice oily and slow. "It's been a lovely evening for a quiet agreement. Too bad you couldn't just stay in the dark." He backed out of the cellar, the door slamming shut with a final, echoing thud. Claire heard the bolts slide home, and then a new sound. The smell of smoke began to drift under the door. A small, orange glow flickered in the hallway. Michael wasn't just leaving her for the police. He was setting a fire. He was going to make sure there was no one left to tell a different story. Claire didn't panic. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She looked up at the ceiling, her eyes searching for the one thing Michael had forgotten: the house's original ventilation system. As a child, she had spent hours exploring the narrow, dust-choked shafts, a secret world that her father had never bothered to map. She climbed onto a wine rack, the wood groaning under her weight. She pushed against the heavy iron grate in the ceiling. It was rusted, the metal biting into her palms, but with a final, desperate shove, it popped free. She hauled herself into the narrow, claustrophobic ductwork, the smell of old soot and scorched dust filling her lungs. She crawled blindly, her elbows scraping against the metal, the heat from the fire below beginning to rise. She could hear the roar of the flames now, a hungry, crackling sound that seemed to chase her through the dark. She followed the pull of the air, moving toward the center of the house until she reached the panic room. The panic room was a high-tech fortress, a room of glass and steel hidden behind a false wall in the gallery. Claire dropped through the ceiling vent, landing hard on the cold tile floor. The room was filled with the hum of servers and the flicker of security monitors. She lunged for the main console. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind working with the mechanical efficiency of a forensic auditor. She didn't try to stop the fire, and she didn't try to call the police. They were already there, their sirens a distant wail through the storm. Instead, she accessed the estate's smart hub. She synced her phone to the public address system, the one Michael had used to broadcast his press conference. She found the recording she had made in the cellar. The recording of Michael's confession, the sound of his voice admitting to the murder and the frame-up. "Let's see how the optics of this look, Michael," she whispered. She hit broadcast. Michael's voice boomed through the mansion, echoing off the marble floors and the burning walls. "I've been wearing your gardening gloves for a week. I used your private stationery to write this suicide note." The sound was deafening, a wall of truth that Michael couldn't outrun. Claire watched the security monitors as the police burst into the foyer. They weren't looking for her. They were looking for the man whose voice was currently confessing to murder over the house speakers. And then, the final twist. The monitors flickered, the high-contrast static clearing for a moment. Claire saw a figure walking through the smoke in the grand foyer. A man with silver hair and a face lined like a topographical map. He was counting the stairs out loud as he descended, his voice a low, rhythmic mutter that Claire felt in her bones. 12? 13. Arthur Sterling was alive. He walked through the chaos with a detached, scientific calm, his eyes fixed on Michael, who was being pinned to the floor by Detective Wilson. Arthur didn't look like a man who had just survived an overdose. He looked like a man who had just completed a successful experiment. "The count is correct," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the noise of the fire alarms. "The rot has been identified." The funeral had been a sting. Arthur, with the help of Robert Henderson and federal agents, had faked his own death to see which of his children would burn the empire down to rule the ashes. He had watched it all through the hidden cameras, a silent judge in a house of monsters. Claire stood in the panic room, watching the screen as Michael was hauled away in handcuffs, his face a mask of pure, impotent rage. She saw her mother, Eleanor, being led out of the study, her silk scarf torn, her flask empty. The storm was clearing. The fire was being contained. But as Claire walked out onto the balcony at dawn, looking over the wreckage of the estate, she felt no triumph. She was the CEO now. She had the data, she had the crown, and she had the family name. But the Sterling legacy was a heavy, cold weight. She stood alone in the rising sun, the smell of jasmine and smoke mingling in the air. She had saved the company, but she had lost the illusion of a family. She had traded her freedom for a seat at a table where the only thing that mattered was the count. The crown was hers, but the house was empty. And as she looked out over the silent, emerald city of Savannah, Claire Sterling realized that, in the end, the only thing the paper trail had proven was that she was exactly like her father. She was a Sterling, and she was alone. The end.